So far in this series, we've examined several exciting levels in Bloodborne, each of which exemplifies a certain characteristic, theme, or design methodology. But even throughout close analysis of game-defining spaces like Central Yharnam's introduction to the game's identity, or the Forbidden Woods' unrelenting pilgrimage to find Byrgenwerth, there is perhaps no area in Bloodborne more important to the design of the world than the Cathedral Ward. But it's also crucial to the game's story, acting as the cardinal goal at the start of the player's adventure, as well as their first exposure to the expansion of a vast world and complex narrative. Without the Cathedral Ward, the entire realm of Yharnam simply wouldn't function the way it does. If each region in Bloodborne is a different organ that gives life to its fascinating game world, the Cathedral Ward is without a doubt the heart, its many arteries pumping blood to other vital areas. But perhaps even more impressive is that its role as a central hub, a defining trait that becomes obvious looking back on the game, feels like just another seamless part of the journey during your actual playthrough. And in this video, we're going to examine how this level manages to so smoothly and beautifully connect the many regions of Yharnam, while also standing out as a distinct and expertly designed area on its own. This is the level design of Bloodborne, Cathedral Ward. The importance of the Cathedral Ward is made apparent long before we actually reach its gloomy plazas and imposing architecture. In fact, in what is basically your first true interaction with another person in Yharnam, seeking the Cathedral Ward is the one solid piece of information you're given at the start of the game, and therefore your entire journey through Bloodborne begins with a quest to find the healing church located somewhere in this yet-to-be-discovered region. This vague introduction to your goal immediately provides a sense of mystery surrounding the Cathedral Ward, as at this point in the game, other than the obvious piece we can discern from the location's name, we don't know where this place is, what it looks like, or what we'll find there. But we do know that we have to get there, because, well, it's directly stated to us in what is pretty much the most straightforward piece of geographical guidance you'll ever get in a FromSoft game.
And deep within Cathedral Ward is the old Grand Cathedral.
So the entire purpose of traversing the lengthy and complexly woven Central Yharnam at the start of the game is simply to reach the Cathedral Ward. And of course, once we arrive there, we begin to learn that this journey will take us much further and much deeper than just the streets of Yharnam, and that we'll encounter foes much stranger and much more out of place than just the beast-like Yharnamites we've encountered so far. The player's journey through this region appropriately begins in one of its several cathedrals, specifically Odin Chapel, one of the very few safe spaces in all of Yharnam. And from the onset, we get a feel for how many options this region will end up offering. The path straight forward leads us outside and eventually up the stairs to a gate that we cannot yet enter. The path to the right presents us with a locked door to an unknown destination, and the path to the left takes us to another courtyard that splits off into two separate routes itself. So from the very start of this far-reaching level, its design as a central area containing multiple spokes becomes clear. And unsurprisingly, it turns out that many of these spokes are in place to lead the player not just to other areas of the Cathedral Ward, but to many of the other regions in Bloodborne as well. As a first-time player, however, this design concept isn't really something that sticks out, because we end up exploring the ward as we would any other level. And it's only much later when we realize just how important the geography and layout of the Cathedral Ward really is to the world of Yharnam overall. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, because even independent from the Cathedral Ward's greater purpose, it also happens to just be an interestingly crafted, surprisingly diverse level in its own right. Utilizing a darker and more grayscale color palette, the Cathedral Ward is a decidedly more moody region than what we saw in Central Yharnam. This is also bolstered by the fact that many areas here are completely devoid of the hunt-happy villagers that were found patrolling the game's introductory level. Instead, in their place are the ghostly church servants who tower over your character and knowingly call you out as an unwelcome guest within their space. Supplement these spooky sentinels with literal giants wielding massive instruments of destruction, and the identity of the Cathedral Ward comes more into focus. This isn't a series of city streets full of amateur vigilantes attempting to protect their neighborhood through the power of numbers. This is an exclusive district within Yharnam, one that's deliberately patrolled by a group of people, or beings, who are specifically there to keep order and keep you out of their business. My initial memory of the Cathedral Ward was one of a homogeneous environment, a geographically large area that utilized the same gray stone architecture throughout. And technically, that's not incorrect, but upon revisiting it, I realized how subtly diverse this level really is. I think one of the most difficult but truly essential challenges for environmental artists is being asked to create distinct spaces within a region that shares the same theme, setting, and general tone. It's a constant balance between making a level feel like it is cohesively all part of the same area, while still crafting landmarks, features, and spaces that are unique enough for the player to easily identify and differentiate between. In testing this challenge, we can actually pretty easily see that this is something the Cathedral Ward excels at, despite its consistently dreary visual themes. The multiple gated plazas feel a lot different than the back alleyways and shuttered up residences. The outer edges and vistas looking out onto Old Yharnam feel a lot different than the rural outskirts on the opposite end of the level. And the emphatic, opulent architecture of the Grand Cathedral feels a lot different than the much more drab setting of Odin Chapel, its inhabitants holding out to hope in the last place they're able. There really is a lot of variety here, not just in the environmental design, but in function as well. In crafting a physically large level that includes so many distinct spaces, the developers are also able to provide the player with many memorable moments to stumble upon during their time in the Cathedral Ward. And that's not an unusual achievement for most well-designed levels. In fact, we discussed this same ability to produce diverse locales in the Design of Central Yharnam video, but it does manifest in a bit of a unique way in the Cathedral Ward. One of the byproducts of this level's design is that because its geography merges with so many of Bloodborne's other regions, the player is exposed to slivers of those places before even traveling to them. Take, for example, the moment when you uncover the underground passage in one of the cathedrals, open the massive door at the end, and get hit with a striking view of Old Yharnam in the distance, or crossing paths with this single, bizarre, alien-like enemy on your way to the Forbidden Woods. This is the only instance of this enemy type you'll encounter in the region, and it's so intentionally out of place it creates this not at all subtle but still very cryptic foreshadowing for what we may encounter throughout the rest of the game. And I'm sure we can all remember the first time we saw the electric blue orb that appears out of thin air in this area of the level, as well as our reaction when we tested out what happens if we touch it. Whoops. Of course, we had no way of knowing at the time, but this interaction is one of our first exposures to the otherworldly forces that are pulling the strings behind the scenes. And most of these moments aren't even part of the main quest for the player during their initial run through the Cathedral Ward. Instead, that route takes them on a potentially spiraling journey through the level to reach its most iconic destination, the Grand Cathedral. If we explore one of the paths available to us at the start of the level, we'll come across one of Bloodborne's several tragic characters, Alfred, Hunter of Vilebloods. Though Alfred's arrogance can be ascertained pretty much right from this first conversation, he does end up being a valuable source of information regarding the Cathedral Ward and the areas beyond it. It's from him we learn of both the Grand Cathedral and the location of Byrgenwerth, which he tells us can only be accessed by a group of scholars who have the password that protects it. So through this interaction, our path forward becomes a bit more clear, and it's a path that requires a direct confrontation with one of Bloodborne's most memorable bosses inside one of its landmark locations. One of the very compelling pieces about the design of the Cathedral Ward is that there end up being multiple distinct options for gaining access to the Grand Cathedral. The easiest of these methods is to simply purchase the Hunter Chief emblem from the Bath Messenger in the Hunter's Dream. What an outrageous sentence. Video games are fucking weird. This approach requires a hefty investment of blood echoes, but it is the much more efficient path as it gives you immediate access through one of the level's main locked gates. However, if you don't want to take that route, don't want to spend your valuable echoes, or maybe you just don't even realize that purchasing this item is an option, you can instead find a way around the gate and reach the cathedral with just a few extra steps. This path requires you to unlock the aforementioned passage down to the entrance to Old Yharnam, fight through its burned up buildings and foggy lower streets, and defeat the blood-starved beast found inside the church on the very edge of its outskirts. Doing so triggers the previously locked door in Odin Chapel to mysteriously open for some reason, and that door leads to the Healing Church Workshop, which you can then descend to enter some lower alleyways before finding an elevator that brings you back behind one of the other gates that's adjacent to the stairway that will lead you up to the Grand Cathedral. That's an insanely complex, densely packed solution to a problem you could just buy your way out of. And it also means that all of the content found in those areas I just described is technically entirely optional. But that's Bloodborne, man. It's a game in which some of the coolest areas and most interesting content never needs to be touched in order to complete the game. What's not optional, however, is the eventual boss fight with Vicar Amelia, which takes place, fittingly, inside the Grand Cathedral. The fight against Vicar Amelia is memorable for several reasons, not the least of which is its grim introduction sequence that has the power to weigh on the player long after the battle has concluded. There's absolutely nothing we can do to stop Amelia's gruesome transformation, and even the screams she lets out in beast form have a tendency to sound more heartbreaking than fearsome. Still, get slapped around this cathedral enough times by her, and you'll be feeling absolutely no remorse repaying the favor once you adjust to her vicious attacks. It's a tough fight for a first-time or under-leveled player, but it stands as one of the truly emblematic boss encounters in Bloodborne. The fight itself is a pointed elevation of the ferocious, unrelenting nature of the beast-centric enemies that you'll encounter throughout the game, demonstrating just how little control these once humans have over the blood-tainted illness that's taken over their will. But the unforgettable introduction also reminds us of what lies within the core of these beasts. Real people, often with good intentions, who got caught in the wrong city at the wrong point in history. Showing Amelia's transformation directly to the player all but forces them to consider these unfortunate circumstances. And the questions this scene gives birth to ultimately end up being a reoccurring motif throughout Bloodborne, as we'll see in later moments like the final interaction with our friend Gilbert from Central Yharnam, or the gruesome experiments found in the research hall in the game's DLC. In fact, the entire premise of Old Yharnam, what becomes of it, and its location directly adjacent to the Cathedral Ward revolves heavily around the moral dilemmas presented by the fates of Yharnam's residents. So in addition to being a challenging, intense battle, and being the key that begins to unlock Bloodborne's secretive narrative, Vicar Amelia's presence is also an overt example of one of Bloodborne's most agonizing themes. But, as we've already learned, even after this climactic moment and memorable boss encounter, our time in Yharnam's nucleus is far from over. Because while we're now able to leave through the password-protected door that will take us to the Forbidden Woods, there's still much more to find here, particularly if you chose the route involving the Hunter Chief emblem earlier. The bridge to Old Yharnam, the entrance to the Unseen Village, the haunting side path leading to Hemwick Charnel Lane, the potentially still locked door in Odin Chapel that takes us to the Healing Church Workshop, and eventually the easily missed route to the Upper Cathedral Ward. Even the game's DLC, The Old Hunters, which contains a large amount of extra content, is not accessed through the Hunter's Dream or Central Yharnam near the beginning of your journey. The player can only enter this new nightmare world by first traveling to the Cathedral Ward and completing a trademark FromSoft sequence of events that's just obscure enough to make you think a bit. That's a whole lot of connections to both required and optional areas in Bloodborne, but the Cathedral Ward is built in a way that handles this task really harmoniously. None of these exits feel tacked on or forced. Each of them connects smoothly with organic transitions between areas, except for perhaps the somewhat unexplained realm-bending entrance to the lecture hall. Take a look at the grassy pathway on the way to Hemwick Charnel Lane that gradually morphs the environment from spooky city to creepy suburb. It's just very rare to find anything in the Cathedral Ward, or really in most of Bloodborne, that's not a thoughtful gradient from one area to the next. In a game that relies heavily on fast travel and separately loaded zones, it's here in these in-game connections between spaces where Bloodborne truly feels like it's in the same family as the original Dark Souls, the gold standard for building a cleverly interconnected world. In theory, you can travel from Master Willem's Perch in Bergenworth all the way to the wide boulevards of Central Yharnam in one seamless journey, and the Cathedral Ward is what allows for that experience. In fact, it's arguably a bit disappointing that this type of travel is never really required of the player in Bloodborne, and is perhaps one of the reasons why the Cathedral Ward is seemingly overlooked as one of the most important areas in any FromSoft game. In contrast to Dark Souls, Bloodborne moves away from forcing the player to manually traverse its world to reach each individual area, instead allowing them to use the headstones in the Hunter's Dream to travel to any already discovered lamp. And while the pros and cons of this design choice could fill an entirely separate video on its own, I think that one of the unfortunate casualties it resulted in is an underappreciation of the Cathedral Ward and its role as Yharnam's smoothly flowing, most centralized level. Settled solidly within the many regions that surround it, the Cathedral Ward is the glue that holds the world of Yharnam together, and in turn makes it feel like one cohesive place, despite the fact that in practice, the player will rarely have to cross through it as one. Its hub and spoke system is intricately laid out, but also cleverly disguised, allowing the level to thrive within its own distinct identity rather than just feeling like one with the sole purpose of acting as a connector to other areas. And this blending of functions is really quite an achievement, because what we see in this level is plenty of beautiful environmental design, some haunting and often intimidating enemies, a few key pieces to Bloodborne's story, and of course, an iconic main boss encounter. But the pieces that may have slipped through the cracks, the role the level plays as a true connector of other regions, other pathways, other discoveries found throughout the world of Yharnam, those pieces are just as important as any individual feature of the level itself. While the Hunter's Dream directly and explicitly serves as Bloodborne's home base, the Cathedral Ward is without a doubt the unofficial central hub of its living game world. From the journey into literal and metaphorical darkness found in the Forbidden Woods, to the unwelcoming and threatening chambers of the Unseen Village, the heavy, reliable stone found throughout the Cathedral Ward builds a foundation strong enough to hold these seemingly disparate areas together into one cohesive world. And as each piece of this troubled city is uncovered, the heart of Yharnam methodically pumps its tainted blood to every corner, indiscriminately spreading the corrosive illness that fuels every new night of the hunt and causes every new hunter to seek the cure. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw here, make sure to like this video, subscribe if you're really into this stuff, and definitely check out the other entries in this series analyzing the level design of Bloodborne. I also have a more detailed series of videos that dives in depth into specific level design decisions of Central Yharnam that you can find free for everyone over on Patreon. See you next time.